heart surgeon appears to have died by his own hand. But forensic science gives investigators a second opinion. To solve a woman's brutal murder, investigators must rely on forensic techniques that haven't been invented yet. But time is on their side. A senseless murder becomes even more perplexing when investigators find two strange marks on the victim. They could mean nothing or everything. Even when the scene of a murder reads like a page of pulp fiction, detectives must somehow piece together the plot. So too must the writers who tell the stories of true crime. The mystery began on a cold Monday morning in February 1996 in Sims Township, Ohio. The usually punctual heart surgeon, Dr. Darrell Sutorius, missed his morning rounds at the hospital for the second day in a row. Attempts to page him brought no response. His colleagues asked the Hamilton County Sheriff's Department to check on the doctor at home. His wife, Della Dante Sutorius, said she didn't know where her husband was. She hadn't seen him in days. But that wasn't unusual. Though they lived under the same roof, the couple led separate lives. She often went weeks without seeing him. The police asked if they could look around the home. First, they checked to see if the doctor's car was in the garage. When they found it, the engine was cold. He hadn't driven it recently. Their search was cut short by a scream. In a basement room, Darrell Sutorius had been found. His head lay in a pool of blood. A steel .38 caliber revolver gleamed on the carpet. After devoting his life to healing others, it appeared the doctor had killed himself. His wife of little more than a year was now a widow. The officers on the scene couldn't foresee that this was the beginning of a case that would be read by hundreds of thousands of true crime fans. As news of the death was splashed across the pages of the Cincinnati newspapers, it caught the attention of best-selling crime writer Aphrodite Jones.
It was the front page of all the papers, and I heard people were talking about it, and I went and grabbed the papers right out on the bookstand, and I just said, whoa, this is it. I just immediately knew this was my story. I had to have this story. It was like falling in love.
This story would become Jones's fourth true crime book. The Sutorius case had all the right ingredients: deception, betrayal, and death. At the scene, there was every indication the victim's death was a suicide. The gun was collected, and gunmetal tests on the victim's hands proved that he had fired the weapon. To try to understand why the victim would take his own life, police questioned his wife, Della. She told them they were practically estranged. In her few encounters with her husband in the weeks before his death, he seemed angry and depressed. He had good reason. Darrell and Della had fought often, mostly about money. To keep the peace, they agreed to live on different floors of the large house they shared. Della believed that her husband had killed himself rather than face a painful divorce. While Della had her say, forensics experts were finding a different story at the scene. Though the doctor may have been lonely, police were not convinced he was by himself when he died. Investigators weren't ready to write it off to suicide just yet. Police found a second bullet lodged in the rug. When the pistol was examined, it was found that 2 shots, not 1, had been fired. Strange as it seems, according to coroner Carl Parrott, that's not unheard of in suicide cases.
Some suicides do include multiple shots. Some suicides include a test shot, or a so-called test shot. It's theorized that people discharge the weapon just to see how loud it is.
But another clue was not so easily dismissed. Among the blood spatters was a smear on the couch cushion. From the position of the mark, it was unlikely that he could have made it as he fell. Sutorius could not have killed himself and then smeared his own blood. It looked as if someone had altered the scene. Parrott also noticed something odd about the position of the body. The victim's right hand was extended out from the couch directly over the gun. It looked like the gun had fallen from his lifeless fingers. But the blood spatter contradicted that.
On the palmar surface, there was sprayed or spattered blood. Spray blood implies that this surface of the hand was up and exposed to blood which is exhaled during terminal respiration. Now, however, the hand is out like this.
The victim's position had apparently changed after the fatal shot. There was no other way to explain the blood on his hand. The head wound was unlike any suicide Dr. Parrott had ever seen.
The gunshot wound of entrance was above the superior attachment of the right ear. And the trajectory was front going at about approximately 45 degrees. This was also a non-contact wound.
The entrance wound was high at the back of the head, and the gun had to have been fired from some distance away.
People typically don't pull the weapon well behind. This is an uncomfortable position to adopt, particularly when you're lying down.
It was unlikely that a surgeon so well versed in anatomy would have risked missing his mark. It now looked like the doctor had been murdered. The irregularities at the scene were incriminating, but not damning. To prove murder, investigators would have to first prove that someone else pulled the trigger. The prime suspect was the victim's widow, Della Sutorius. But they lacked solid evidence. To find out more about the couple's relationship, detectives talked to friends and relatives. The doctor's attorney revealed that Darrell Sutorius had confided that he was afraid of his wife and wanted to end their marriage. In fact, his divorce papers were waiting to be executed on the same day his body was found. That contradicted what Della had told police. Either Sutorius had changed his mind about seeking divorce, or Della was lying.
But I need to get out of this.
Where are the kids now? Are they with me?
The case against Della was building. Hamilton County, Ohio's Chief Assistant Prosecutor Tom Longano was brought in.
To our case, the forensic evidence was most important, coupled with the facts that she had made statements to people that she would do him bodily harm, and Darrell, in fact, had confided in friends and relatives that he was in fear for his life, that Della had threatened to kill him.
It seemed that Della had made good on her threats. But first, she cast her spell on Sutorius. Investigators learned that the lonely doctor had met his bride-to-be through a dating service and had rushed to the altar only 3 months later, seduced by her lies. The honeymoon hadn't lasted long. Della Sutorius' stylish cover story soon opened onto page after page of dime novel violence and deception.
And she was posing as somebody named Dante, and he didn't care. And she was posing as somebody who went to UCLA and graduated from college, and he never checked on it. And she was posing as somebody who had all this fantastic knowledge of the arts, etc. He never knew anything about that. He knew she looked good in a bathing suit. She claimed that she loved him, and that's all he cared about.
She had no college education as she purported, and until she set her sights on the doctor, she was in constant need of money. She'd been married 4 times before, not twice, as she said during their brief courtship. She had been Della Hoffer, Della Bayer, Della Bassett, and Della Britton. Each of her relationships had ended in angry divorces. Her marriage to Sutorius seemed to be following the same course. Della and the doctor's fights over money became increasingly bitter. Their rancor reached new heights when the surgeon's daughter announced her wedding plans. Della refused to allow Sutorius to pay for his daughter's wedding.
She has a right to have a wedding that she wants.
Della had a fanatical need to fuel her spendthrift ways. Without a prenuptial agreement, she would gain little from a divorce.
They were not married very long, and under Ohio law, she was not really entitled to much by way of financial settlement. On the other hand, if he had died of a suicide or natural causes, she stood to inherit about $1 million.
It was to Della's benefit to prevent the divorce. Did that mean murder? Perhaps. But investigators needed hard evidence to make the case. The peek into her past revealed her capacity for violence. She had set one boyfriend on fire while he slept. She threatened another with a gun.
This cycle of violence escalated throughout her life. So it went from being just throwing things around with husband number 1, throwing dishes and that kind of thing, to then all of a sudden, destroying property of the car and this and that with husband number 2, to then destroying homes, to then pulling knives. And with the last husband, she took a gun and pulled the trigger at his head. It was empty. The bullets were not in the gun, but she didn't know that. She didn't know that. She was ready to kill David Britton. He testified to that in court. She was going to blow his head off.
In the case of Daryl Sutorius, it appeared that Della may have succeeded in her murderous plans.
Yes, I'm looking for a gun for self-defense.
Investigators traced the serial number on the gun that killed the doctor.
It's a .38 revolver.
It was registered to Della Sutorius, purchased shortly before the murder. Further checks revealed that this was not the first pistol she'd owned. An officer on the case recalled that several months before the shooting, a man had approached him to turn in a .22 caliber handgun.
I have a gun in the trunk that I'd like to give you. Want to show it to
He said it belonged to his wife, and that she had threatened him with it.
me? This gun is
That man was Daryl Sutorius. The officer told him to hand over the weapon at the police station and to file charges of domestic violence. The gun was turned in, but he didn't file charges.
So he thought he got the gun out of the house and he was safe. Little did he know, she went out and bought herself another gun.
The owner of the gun shop where Della bought her second pistol remembered that she was a tough customer. He told police that even though a shooting lesson was included in the price of the weapon, Della didn't need it. She was a natural deadeye. And with the loaded pistol in her hand, she'd told him she wouldn't let her husband get away with divorce. But hearsay about threats still wasn't enough to bring charges. Investigators had to place her in the room with the smoking gun. The death of Dr. Daryl Sutorius looked like murder. Investigators had learned that his wife Della had both motive and opportunity to kill him. But could they raise tangible evidence to prove it? Coroner Carl Parrott thought he could. He noted that a thin sheen of blood covered practically all of the gun's surfaces.
Occasionally you'll see blood on a weapon after a suicide, but the distribution is where you'd expect it to be. On the muzzle, front sight, maybe the front of the trigger guard, The places you would not expect to see it are on the grips, which are shielded by the shooter's hand.
Parrott found a partial bloody palm print left on the grip of the weapon. He determined that the print had been transferred to the grip by a blood-stained hand when the blood was almost dry. Given the lethal nature of his wound, Dr. Sutorius could not have shot himself, dropped the gun, and then picked it up again. Finally, here was proof positive that a second person had been at the scene. The print was too smeared to compare it with Della's, but Della Sutorius had no alibi for the weekend her husband lay dead in the basement. When all the evidence was assembled, the events of the doctor's last day alive became clear. The style to which Della Sutorius had grown accustomed was slipping through her fingers. Pressure was mounting. Divorce was imminent. On Saturday, February 17th, she reached the end of her rope and the end of the 8-day waiting period to pick up her new gun. After shooting her sleeping husband, she arranged his body to make it appear that he had killed himself. Then she placed the gun in the lifeless hand and pulled the trigger once more, making the bullet hole in the floor. Now, gunshot residue would be found on the doctor's hand by any forensic expert who looked for it. On February 27, 1996, the widow was arrested for the murder of her husband. In her book, Della's Web, Aphrodite Jones described the final moments of the trial 4 months later.
The sordid saga of Della Dante Faye Hall Hofer Beyer Bassett Britton Sutorius ended on June 7, 1996. A tear rolled down her face as she listened to closing arguments. Then Della collapsed in her chair as the jury announced the verdict: guilty of aggravated murder in the death of her husband.
The widow Sutorius was sentenced to life in prison. She will be 70 years old before she's eligible for parole. Though many homicides are solved with the tools at hand, sometimes the clues, and ultimately the victim, must wait for new technology to reveal their secrets. Best-selling true crime writers Don Weber and Charles Bosworth Jr. found themselves thrust into the midst of just such a case in June 1978 in the quiet town of Wood River, Illinois. Carla Brown had just gotten engaged to her high school sweetheart, David Hart, and they were moving in together. Hart went to work as usual, leaving Brown to start arranging their home. But later that morning, when a friend stopped by to see the new house, Brown didn't come to the door. After work, Hart gave his friend a tour. He couldn't understand why his fiancée had gone out and left the door unlocked.
Carla. She's got to be in the basement.
As they walked through the house, the reason became horribly clear. Carla Brown hadn't gotten far in her unpacking before she was attacked. Police found her on her knees, doubled over, with her head in a bucket of water. Her hands were lashed behind her back. She was naked from the waist down. Police questioned David Hart. He was inconsolable. His co-workers confirmed that Brown had been murdered while he was at work. He was not a suspect. Detectives processed the scene for clues. Slashed electrical wire had been used to bind the victim's hands. She had 2 linear bruises on her face and neck. She had been sexually assaulted. Socks tied around her throat suggested she'd been strangled. A pool of water, tinted pink from the victim's blood, was found beneath one end of the couch. More blood led from the couch to the body. But the most perplexing clue lay not on the floor, but overhead. The carafe from a coffee maker was jammed into the rafters. Illinois State Police crime scene inspector Alva Bush didn't trust what he saw at the scene. He had worked many homicides involving sexual assault and felt that the position of the victim meant the scene had been staged.
The victim was bound around one wrist, and then the cord went underneath her and came up, and the other wrist was tied. And I felt that this wasn't right because it would allow the victim access to her attacker.
Inspector Bush made sure a painstaking series of photographs was taken of the entire scene. Then the body was wrapped in a sheet so that no trace evidence would be lost during transport to the coroner's lab. When the victim's injuries were examined, it was determined that she'd been struck a single devastating blow. It had broken her jaw in 2 places and left 2 blunt trauma bruises on her face. The marks suggested the back of a claw hammer. Though Carla Brown had fiercely resisted her attacker, she'd been overpowered and possibly knocked unconscious. Ultimately, her cause of death was drowning. Charles Bosworth Jr., a reporter who covered this case for the St. Louis Post-Dispatch, experienced firsthand the community's fear and outrage.
This was a murder that happened in the home of a lovely young woman minding her own business, moving into a home, starting a new life with her fiancé. It happened in broad daylight, and it immediately raised the issue for us of the lack of safety in a person's own home, and that terrifies the public.
Co-author Don Weber, who in 1978 was the assistant state's attorney, was called into the case. The criminal, whoever he was, undermined any sense of safety.
The hardware store sold out of locks. Women were afraid to go anywhere by themselves. The impression I got when I went to the house was it was just a terrible, brutal, cold-blooded crime, and there were absolutely no clues.
Police interviewed Carla Brown's neighbors. One witness said that on the day of the murder, she'd seen 2 men drinking beer and smoking marijuana in the yard of the house next door to the crime scene. The 2 men were brought in for polygraph tests. John Prenti passed the test, displaying no abnormal responses to the questions. But when Dwayne Conway's turn came, the results were declared inconclusive due to erratic emotional disturbances. Only a disturbed mind could commit a crime like this one. Conway became the lead suspect, but the crime scene gave as many mixed signals as his polygraph.
During the first 30 years,
no identifiable fingerprints were found at the crime scene. The case reached an impasse. After a year, even though Carla Brown's killer was still at large, the murder investigation was called off. Then, a chance encounter over 1,000 miles away broke it open. A murder case may be officially closed, but it's never forgotten. That was true of the Carla Brown case. In 1979, almost a year after the crime, investigator Alva Bush traveled from Illinois to New Mexico to testify in an unrelated stolen vehicle case. When that trial was delayed, he passed the time attending a seminar on a brand new forensic technology, photographic image enhancement. He had no idea this seminar would be the turning point for the Brown investigation. The lecturer that day was medical investigator Homer Campbell.
On most photographs, there's more information than you really perceive. And what enhancement does in different steps, it really simplifies the photograph. It makes the edges clear, for instance. It lets you see different segments of the film differently.
With renewed hope, Bush sent photographs of the Carla Brown murder scene to Campbell for analysis. He hoped this new technology would help solve an old case. The photographs were enhanced using a computer that pared away only the blurred fragments of each image, one tiny section at a time. In the Brown case, the results were dramatic. Campbell called Bush with his initial findings. The twin bruising on the victim's face had been caused when the killer struck her with the metal legs of a TV tray, which were barely visible in one photograph. The victim's former fiancé, David Hart, still had the TV tray in his home. When police re-examined it, they discovered microscopic traces of blood and a short strand of blonde hair, but no fingerprints. Though the weapon had been found, the killer was still free. But Campbell's enhancement of the photographs provided even more shocking evidence of the killer's brutality.
Then he kind of dropped the bomb on me when he says, what about the bite marks on her neck? And I just couldn't believe it. I said, what bite mark? And he says, she's definitely got a bite mark on her neck.
The enhanced image made it clear the victim had sustained a savage bite during her assault. Since the bite was inflicted close to her time of death, the bruises had no chance to heal. But they'd still been too faint to draw notice, until now.
The first thing is to examine the injury itself. And from the injury, what is the investigator able to see? Can he see what's called gross characteristics? Can he see little individual characteristics, maybe something individual about this that would really make it different from anything else?
Campbell determined that Carla Brown's killer had a small mouth with crooked teeth. After 1 year with no breaks whatsoever, this gave police their first solid lead.
We knew that we had something now that we could link to the killer, something very personal, something he's not going to change. I can recall that I was excited about it because I felt that this guy would have to pull all of his teeth out, at least most of the ones in front, to get away from this type of evidence.
By the early 80s, forensic experts were depending more and more on the unique characteristics of bite marks. The prime suspect, Dwayne Conway, was forced by the court to have an impression made of his upper teeth.
A little bit longer.
This mold was then sent to Dr. Campbell.
By going to the teeth, you look again at the gross characteristics of the teeth. You look at the individual characteristics of the teeth. You look for something a little different that would make this individual.
The photos simply didn't provide enough information. Without a clearer view of the bite wound, the case would grind to a halt. Stymied at every turn, there was only one path open to investigators. They started the paperwork to have Carla Brown's remains disinterred. But the investigation moved forward on another front. Detectives on the case learned that the new science of psychological profiling was helping police close murder cases across the country. Detective Bush and his colleagues wondered if a profiler could help them get inside the mind of Carla Brown's murderer. They gathered all the crime scene photos and drove more than 800 miles to the FBI's Behavioral Science Unit in Quantico, Virginia. There, pioneer profiler John Douglas studied the images and made a startling prediction.
Douglas was just amazing. You know, he started just talking after he'd seen the photographs, and he says that the crime scene was definitely staged, and that if we're going to exhume Carla's body, that we need to do a lot of high-profile news media on it. And he says that this guy, the killer, will call you, he'll contact you, and he'll want to inject himself into the investigation.
The timing of this new information couldn't have been better. In May of 1982, 4 years after her death, permission to exhume Carla Brown's remains was finally granted. As the FBI profiler recommended, the police and the media cooperated, making a public event of the grim proceeding. To further shake up the murderer, investigators publicized the previously unknown fact that the victim had a bite mark on her body and that an arrest in the case was imminent. According to Assistant State's Attorney Don Weber, this was all-out psychological warfare.
We were trying to make the killer nervous. He'd coped with the crime. He'd learned that he got away with it. He was really proud of himself. And John Douglas said, you have to make him nervous.
While new photos were being taken of the bite marks on the victim, Weber's office received a telephone call from the prime suspect's friend.
During an office meeting we were having about this case, my secretary broke in and said, John Prante's on the phone.
Though Prante had passed a polygraph and wasn't a suspect, he was behaving like the killer.
That wouldn't have worked out.
The profiler said the killer would try to insinuate himself into the investigation. That's what John Prante was doing. The publicity surrounding Brown's exhumation and the bite wound also brought out new witnesses who called investigators with crucial information.
He told me she had bite marks in her neck.
They said that at a party just 1 week after Carla Brown's death, Prante had been describing the murder scene to his friends in lurid detail, including a description of the bite mark. The only way he could have known about the mark 3 years before the police learned of it was if he'd inflicted the wound himself. Prante was ordered to give a dental impression. The mold, along with the impressions of 3 other people, were forwarded to a forensic odontologist for analysis.
Okay, be real still.
We brought him 4 sets of dental impressions, and we said, which one is our killer? And he put 3 aside immediately, and then he took up Prante's dental impressions, and he measured them, and he got a caliper out, and he looked at the picture, and then he just sat down, and he said, that's your man.
Extreme patience and new forensic techniques had finally justified an arrest warrant. On June 8, 1982, 4 years after the murder of Carla Brown, John Prante was arrested.
One thing about a homicide investigation, they're forever. There's nothing sacred in them. You continue to search for that individual. There's no statute of limitations that you have to deal with. So if somebody out there has done a murder, you're fair game forever until it's solved.
When the evidence was assembled, police sketched a picture of the victim's first morning in her new home and her last day alive. Prante made a sexual advance that was strongly rebuffed. The struggle escalated until Prante bit Brown on the neck and struck her face with the TV tray, knocking her unconscious. He tried to revive her by splashing water on her face from the coffee carafe. When his efforts failed, he redressed her and tied socks around her neck to hide the bite mark, bound her hands, and tipped her forward into the bucket of water, where she drowned. After Prante fled the scene, he washed the telltale blood from his hands at the home of next-door neighbor, Dwayne Conway. Thanks to the emerging sciences of image enhancement, forensic odontology, and psychological profiling, Carla Brown's killer was finally brought to justice.
Those interminable seconds, the period of time Don Weber hated more than anything else, passed as the verdict was handed from the foreman to the bailiff to the young judge. Reading his first trial verdict, Judge Romani said solemnly, "The verdict the court has been handed reads as follows. We, the jury, find the defendant, John Prantty, guilty of the offense of murder."
On September 27, 1982, Prantty was sentenced to 75 years in prison. While the process of solving a crime can bring welcome resolution, it can also stir up some ugly ghosts from the past. Clifford Leyendecker has been a true crime writer for 22 years. He has published 32 books to date.
Being a crime writer is the greatest job in the world. Every book or every magazine piece I do, I get to look into the lives of new people, look into the deaths of new people too, for that matter. But you really see life at its rawest. You strip everybody's secrets away, and if you're a snoop, a former journalist, that can be pretty exciting.
In the last century, Leo Tolstoy wrote that every unhappy family is unhappy in its own way. Leyendecker found that it's still true, and still makes good reading.
I kind of pride myself on keeping up on what's happening with true crime, and especially my favorites now, which I call family murders.
In 1993, Leyendecker learned of a brutal murder case in the resort town of Steamboat Springs, Colorado. It began in October at the hardware store owned by Jerry and Douglas Boggs. On this morning, Jerry was very late for work, and Douglas was worried. Douglas tried to reach his older brother by phone. No one answered. When he went to Jerry's house to check on him, Douglas found him, brutally murdered on the kitchen floor. An officer from the Steamboat Springs Police Department responded to Douglas Boggs's call. He confirmed that Jerry Boggs was past all help.
We got a 1052, 1090, supervisor on scene.
Though there was a deep gash across the victim's forehead, death had come from 2 gunshots to the back. Detective Rick Kratz was called to the scene and noticed something unusual.
In looking at Jerry Boggs's body, there was a mark that on his ear and in his cheek right here that we could never figure out what the mark was. It was kind of reddish and circular, and there was a spot up on the lobe of his ear. But I mean, we guessed at the onset that this is a muzzle of a gun being shoved into his head, and that was the bruising and the mark left by a gun muzzle.
A blood-stained shovel was discovered at the crime scene. It provided another possible explanation for the marks. If the victim had been struck with the tool, the rivets could have made the wounds. Police also found a slug and blood drops on the floor, along with pools of blood. As Agent Tom Griffin examined the blood spatters, the full savagery of the murder became clearer.
This convergence of stains, this three-dimensional convergence, was basically underneath the ceiling beam. The ceiling beam had a curved gouge in it, which was suspected to be a result of the shovel, the blade of the shovel coming in contact with the ceiling beam.
Investigators collected several shell casings. Perhaps they could hold a clue to lead them to the killer. Forensic experts continued to build the case. After the fatal slugs were removed from the victim, they were submitted to the firearms lab at the Colorado Bureau of Investigation. There, Agent Alan Hammond went to work.
I was able to determine that the bullets were .22 long rifle caliber. They had been fired from a barrel of a firearm that had rifling of 8 lands and grooves with a right twist.
Detectives had a bullet, but no gun. They had a shovel, but no clue as to who wielded it. By now, the killer could be miles away or very close to home. Police in Colorado had few leads and fewer suspects in the shooting death of Jerry Boggs. They turned their attention to the man closest to the victim, his brother Doug.
Well, Doug Boggs found the body. So at that point in time, everybody that is associated with that is a suspect.
Well, I left when I went to look for him.
Blood and hair samples were taken from Doug Boggs and compared to forensic evidence from the scene. No match was found. Doug was not the killer, but he did point investigators to a suspect, his former sister-in-law, Jill Coit. Jerry Boggs had met Coit while she was restoring her bed and breakfast in town. She bought all her hardware at the Boggs' store, and soon the lifelong bachelor allowed no one but himself to wait on her. After their wedding in April of 1991, Jerry Boggs assumed part ownership of Jill Coit's bed and breakfast. But soon, Jerry and Jill began having marital trouble. Boggs was shocked to learn that his wife was still married to another man. Boggs insisted they separate until she ended her other marriage. Jill left, but as writer Clifford Leyendecker discovered in researching his book, Jill returned to Steamboat Springs, making an amazing claim.
Jill either rented or borrowed a baby and showed up in Steamboat Springs and went around town showing everybody and said, this is Jerry's baby, and this rotten guy threw me out of the house, and he won't take care of me, and he won't support his little girl.
The child couldn't be his, or even hers. A partial hysterectomy years before had left Jill Coit unable to have more children. What was Coit up to? To find out, Boggs hired a private detective. The results of her report were startling.
The private investigators actually turned up quite a history for Jill, and of course they relayed that to Jerry.
Coit had been married not once, but 11 times before Jerry Boggs, to 9 different men. Like her marriage to Boggs, several of her other marriages had overlapped. Boggs had his marriage annulled, and soon Coit sued him for his share of the bed and breakfast. The case was bitterly contested. Investigators wondered if this was a motive for murder. If Coit's long string of marriages wasn't enough, police found another skeleton rattling in her closet. In Texas, one of Jill Coit's former husbands had also met an untimely death decades before.
When we began to investigate Jill Coit, we'd uncovered, numerous marriages, and several of those marriages were bigamous. We found out that she was a prime suspect in a murder of a previous husband, William Coit, in Houston, and it was like 20 years earlier. And following up on that murder, the murders were phenomenally similar.
William Coit, like Jerry Boggs, had been shot in the back at close range, the .22 caliber bullets piercing his lungs. For lack of evidence, Jill Coit was never charged in William Coit's death. It seemed history was about to repeat itself. Investigators in the Jerry Boggs murder faced the same circumstances. Then, one of Jerry Boggs' neighbors revealed a startling piece of information. She told police that on the day of the murder, she had seen 2 men walking by her house. What caught her eye was that they were wearing heavy coats on a mild fall afternoon. Then she realized that one of the men was actually a woman wearing a false mustache. Jerry Boggs' attorney confirmed that he and his wife had once seen a woman disguised as a man driving past the courthouse. The woman was definitely Jill Coit.
We learned during the subsequent investigation that Jill Coit did this. She dressed up as a man, wore beard and mustache, and she'd use this disguise to follow Jerry Boggs around town, you know, spying on him.
Police suspected that the two mysterious men were really Jill and her boyfriend, Michael Backus. But Jill Coit told police that at the time of Jerry Boggs' murder, she and Backus were away camping. Police had no solid leads to support an arrest. As the investigation stalled, Coit sped to the airport, clutching tickets to Mexico. Police could only watch as she boarded a flight to freedom. Two men were dead, killed 20 years apart. Both were shot in the back with .22 caliber pistols, and both had been married to Jill Coit. She was the prime suspect in the death of Jerry Boggs, but she was still in Mexico, beyond the reach of authorities. Even if she returned to the States, coincidence was not strong enough evidence for police to bring charges. Then, according to crime writer Clifford Leindecker, a surprise witness turned the case around.
I think the turning point in the investigation really occurred when Jill's oldest son, Seth, Stephen Seth, turned against her.
Not only had Jill Coit and Michael Backus openly planned the murder of Jerry Boggs in front of her son, she'd even called him when the butchery was finished, telling him, "It's done and it's messy." Seth had reason to believe her. He'd found evidence of the deed in a bathroom sink at the bed and breakfast, where she may have washed up. With Seth Coit's testimony, police now had a case, but they couldn't act until Jill Coit came back to Colorado. Finally, in November 1993, investigators got a call from her son once again. He said that Jill Coit was making a quick visit to the U.S. to tie up some loose ends on the sale of a property. Though she sneaked into town in the dead of night, police were waiting for her. As it turned out, Jill Coit and Michael Backus would be staying in Steamboat Springs much longer than they had planned. When detectives searched the suspect's car, they found spent .22 caliber cartridges in the ashtray. And then they discovered a weapon they weren't even searching for. A stun gun.
What do you think of this?
A stun gun uses two electrodes to deliver a non-lethal shock of 100,000 volts. It can incapacitate a human being for several minutes. Suddenly, the strange marks on the victim's face and neck began to make sense. But forensic data on stun gun injuries was scarce because they were so rarely fatal. Detective Kratz contacted the Arapahoe County coroner, Dr. Michael Doberson, for help.
Just by measuring the distance from the electrodes on the stun gun, we were able to compare that with the injury that we saw in the picture, and found that these injuries were pretty closely related to where the electrodes would have been.
Though autopsy photographs gave some clues about the marks on the body, only tissue samples from the victim's remains would prove that a stun gun caused the marks. If investigators could find tissue damage consistent with the use of a stun gun, they could connect Jill Coit to the murder scene. But by now, Jerry Boggs' remains had been buried for 10 months. They were exhumed to look for evidence. Doberson found some.
Not only was there an injury on the cheek, but there were also similar types of injuries or scratches on the earlobe and also on the outside of the ear.
Samples of the injuries were closely analyzed. Because skin tissue is electrically charged, high voltage can disturb its structure. Near the surface of the damaged area, the skin had greatly thinned out. The charged nuclei of all the cells had begun to align and migrate beneath the surface like iron filings on a magnet or a school of fish in a current. But this current wasn't water, it was electricity, lots of it. To Doverson, the results were conclusive. The skin showed all the signs of an electrical injury. The stun gun in Jill Coyte's car linked her to the injuries on her ex-husband's body. After months of investigation, police now knew what had happened on the day Jerry Boggs died. Jill Coyte and Michael Backus had ambushed Jerry Boggs soon after he'd come home. The victim was assaulted with the stun gun first, then beaten with the shovel. 3 gunshots later, the crime was complete.
Once her husband was back in Culver, she worked quickly.
Clifford Leindecker's book, Poisoned Vows, details the end of the sordid tale.
The jury deliberated only 5 hours before returning verdicts against both defendants of guilty to all counts. She picked the wrong town, she picked the wrong man, and she picked the wrong family, Douglas Boggs said of his former sister-in-law after the verdicts were revealed.
For their crimes, Jill Coyte and Michael Backus were sentenced to life in prison. Forensic evidence, both from the scene and from the grave, had unraveled the mystery. When the plot is murder, investigators must piece together the real story from a tangle of seemingly unrelated clues. As long as killers think they are above the law, there will always be tales of true crime. But forensic science will always write the final chapter.